One of the most polarizing figures in all of comic books is stepping away. At least from the big two, Joe Quesada is leaving Marvel Comics. He's been such a present figure for Marvel Comics for so long. A lot of people, when they think about Marvel Comics, they might just think about Joe Quesada. He's had a lot of ups. He's had a lot of downs. What's the saying? Given enough time, every hero becomes the villain of his own story. Kind of feels like that's sort of what happened to Joe Quesada at the end. Today, he took to his private Facebook and Twitter to let fans know he's stepping away from Marvel Comics. Quesada became known for his comics of the 1990s, eventually becoming editor of Marvel Comics Marvel Knights in 1998, and then editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics in 2000. Since then, Quesada was named Chief Creative Officer in 2010, and then retitled as Executive Vice President and Creative Director in October 2019. I know a lot of you may have a low opinion of Joe Quesada right now, but if you think about it, during his time as EIC at Marvel Comics, that was the last great era of Marvel Comics that we've had. There's really been three of them, in my opinion. You had the genesis of Marvel Comics there in the early 60s. We got Fantastic Four, X-Men, Avengers, all that stuff. We had the Jim Shooter era, where essentially you have 5 of the 10 greatest comic book runs of all times. And then you have the late double aughts into the very early 2010s when Joe Quesada was at the helm, and he really revolutionized Marvel. Everything was good at Marvel there for like a 3 or 4 year period. And Joe Quesada was the man in charge at the time, and you have to give him credit for that. Unfortunately, he did make some bad decisions, and a lot of the things that he championed and implemented at Marvel Comics have come back to haunt the company, have come back to haunt him, and really have come back to haunt comic book readers. I'll get to that a little bit more in detail here in a few minutes, but we have to admit his work on Marvel Knights was stupendous. We got the Ultimate Universe. We had a lot of really good stuff. And Joe Quesada, for a time, was really good at connecting with comic book readers. Was he Stan Lee? Absolutely not. There's one Stan Lee, and there will never be another one. But Joe Quesada was the most recent figure that we've had that has been, I don't know, Stan Lee-esque, where he could communicate and get people excited with comic books and kind of be that ambassador to the normie to bring him into the hobby. Unfortunately, he kind of lost that touch, and I don't know, he just became kind of a troll there at the end as he lost power within Marvel Comics. He seemed to become pretty bitter, and he was just lashing out and being really rude to people. And I, for one, have certainly been waiting for this day to come. I'm not sure that he got fired. It doesn't sound like it. It sounds like he's retiring from Marvel Comics. But he had lost power, and he was replaced. There was a time that he was an executive officer at Marvel Entertainment, and that power has been gone for quite some time. In October 2019, Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige was named new Marvel Chief Creative Officer. Marvel's former Chief Creative Officer, Joe Quesada, was named Executive Vice President, Creative Director for the company. He maintained a creative role for Marvel Entertainment and reported to President of Marvel Entertainment, Dan Buckley. It is surprising that he actually lasted over 2 years in this position. He was still making a lot of money, but does it seem like he was doing anything? Pretty much all of his power had been ceded to other people at that time. He was no longer the EIC. He's no longer the CCO. As far as I can tell, he was sitting in his office playing Hearts, or maybe Solitaire or something like that. He wasn't doing a lot. I mentioned he was doing some interviews here and there, maybe a public appearance for the company, but he wasn't making decisions. He wasn't doing a lot of creative. And I personally thought he would be gone within a year of that demotion. Obviously, that didn't happen. He lasted a little bit longer. But it had become quite clear that there was really no place in the modern Marvel Comics for Joe Quesada. He just wasn't a hot property anymore. He didn't seem to have that touch. He didn't really seem to have that connection with readers, really knowing what they wanted. And it seems like Marvel Comics have been headed in a kind of a bad direction for quite some time. Although I don't blame really any of that on Joe Quesada anymore. I just don't think he had any power. I think he was just on the internet being mean to people. While he does leave a lasting legacy of excellence, obviously, with his Marvel Knight stuff, during his time as EIC, a lot of really great things happened. He brought in a lot of creators that never would have worked for Marvel prior. They did have their house style, and he kind of changed the game. I think now we're kind of seeing that as maybe not a good thing, but there is a lot of baggage on Joe Quesada. He did become the villain of his own story, kind of by his own design. It was kind of all his fault. During his time at Marvel, Quesada oversaw a number of major line innovations and reforms. He was largely responsible for the controversial One More Day Spider-Man story that removed Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson's marriage from continuity and allowed for a soft reboot of the Spider-Man caricature. He also took risks on creators like Brian Michael Bendis and others who freshened up Marvel, who were kind of stuck at their house style at the time. Quesada is also widely credited for embracing stories that are written with collected editions in mind, also called writing for the trade. Well, that first one I mentioned is quite the black eye. One More Day drove a ton of Spider-Man fans away from Marvel Comics for good. There are still people. Their last comic book they ever read from Marvel Comics was Spider-Man One More Day. It's hated that much. Peter Parker making a deal with the devil to undo his marriage to Mary Jane to save his very elderly, dying of natural causes aunt was a terrible creative decision, but Marvel Comics and Joe Quesada could never really admit that they did anything wrong. They never could go back on it. That's one of Joe Quesada's real negatives as a leader and a creative person. He's very stubborn. He can't admit when he makes a mistake. So that was a terrible decision. Obviously, bringing creators like Brian Michael Bendis on board at the time, we got the Ultimate Universe. We got a lot of really cool stuff. We got Hickman, we got Remender. You think about those, that's like the last really good Fantastic Four story we got. That's the last good Captain America story we got. He also brought in Grant Morrison for X-Men, so that was widely considered a good change. So he did spice Marvel Comics up, and he definitely brought a lot of people in, but he probably changed things too much. The Marvel house style at the time probably needed to be updated a little bit to bring it into more modern times, but it has deviated so far off course at this time that it's almost unrecognizable. Obviously, that didn't happen under Joe Quesada's watch, but it certainly started under Joe Quesada. And the last thing I mentioned, embracing writing for the trades has really just killed the storycraft of comic books in general. I can't lay this one all at the feet of Joe Quesada. He wasn't writing the stories, but he was embracing the idea and encouraging writers to kind of follow in Brian Michael Bendis' footsteps and really write stories with collected editions in mind. We've got really slow, meandering, dull stories nowadays. Things that would have taken a half an issue back in the day are taking 6 months to complete at this time because you got to get them all into one collected issue. It's absolutely ridiculous. So as much good as Joe Quesada did for Marvel Comics and just comic books in general, he also has a tainted legacy as well. Not just the way that he was treating people there at the end. In my opinion, he was lowering himself to kind of get involved with that. Like I said, you be above the fray. But making mistakes and never being able to admit it is not a good leadership trait. Obviously, bringing all these new creators freshened up Marvel Comics at the time, but now it's deviated quite a bit. And writing for the trades, that's not a good legacy to have. Now, there's one thing that's worse than all of them. There has been a response tweet to Joe Quesada announcing that he was leaving Marvel Comics, and this is what Gail Simone had to say. "You changed the face of comics, Joe Quesada. Thank you. And more personally, you were the first person to hire me to write mainstream comics, and you changed the entire course of my life for the better. I am grateful every day." Oh, my goodness. Joe Quesada is responsible for Gail Simone and all her terrible takes in comic books being part of the mainstream. God damn it, Joe Quesada, what were you thinking? You took a chance on an unknown clout chaser, you gave her a job, and you created a monster. Hopefully, hindsight being 2020, Joe Quesada knows if he could go back in time and change things, maybe Gail Simone wouldn't have got that big prank. But listen, whenever you have legacies like this, when you're with a company for over 20 years in that kind of capacity, you're going to have good stuff, you're going to have bad stuff. It's all part of his legacy, but he is a big loss. He's been around Marvel Comics for so long. For a lot of people that are reading Marvel today, he's been there the entire time. He might have been the only person really there the entire time. So I imagine for them, this is a big loss. Me personally, I think this is a good thing. Will anything change? Not really. I don't think he was doing anything. But getting rid of some of the old guard that had terrible takes and were just really rude to the fans, I don't think is a bad step to make. We shall see what happens with Marvel Comics in the future. Now, there is somebody that's important within comic books. You probably heard of him, Robert Kirkman. He has an opinion on Joe Quesada about their relationship, his time working with him when Kirkman was a young writer working for Marvel. He wasn't very thrilled with Joe Quesada. If you don't have the details, if you don't remember this, I have a video about it talking about what Robert Kirkman had to say about Joe Quesada and his terrible leadership. You got to watch this one. It's hilarious.